Welcome to the Restricted Handling Daily Intel Brief. This is what's been going on in Iran and the Middle East in the past 24 hours. Today, the biggest development in the Iran conflict is that the fight is moving from a dispute over shipping routes into a broader contest over who gets to define the rules of the Gulf. The immediate issue remains the Strait of Hormuz. But the more important strategic question is whether Iran can force the international community to accept a new reality, that Tehran has a say over how one of the world's most important maritime corridors operates. The United States is trying to prevent that outcome by combining military pressure, sanctions, and diplomatic leverage. The latest fighting is rooted in the collapse of the June memorandum of understanding between Washington and Tehran. The disagreement comes down to a few carefully written lines about maritime traffic. Iran believes the agreement gave it authority to manage passage through Hormuz. The U.S. believes it committed Iran to reopening the waterway for unrestricted commercial shipping. That ambiguity has become the entire battlefield. And this is where the situation gets complicated. Iran does not need to physically shut down every ship moving through Hormuz to achieve strategic success. It only needs to make the cost and uncertainty high enough that companies, insurers, and ship captains decide they would rather avoid the route. That strategy is already producing results. Shipping companies have become increasingly hesitant to use alternate routes near Oman that were intended to bypass Iranian control. Some tanker captains have refused to make the transit altogether. The message from Tehran is essentially, you may have freedom of navigation on paper, but we can still make operating here extremely uncomfortable. That kind of pressure campaign is very familiar in Iranian strategy. For decades, Tehran has relied on asymmetric tools because it understands it cannot match the United States ship for ship or aircraft for aircraft. Instead, Iran looks for ways to create uncertainty, raise costs, and force opponents to spend more resources protecting their interests. The economic consequences are becoming more visible. Oil prices remain elevated as markets try to determine whether the disruption is temporary or whether the Gulf is entering a prolonged period of risk. Brent crude has moved above $85 a barrel, reflecting concerns that a conflict affecting Hormuz could eventually impact global energy supplies. The United States is attempting to counter that leverage by increasing economic pressure on Iran's financial networks. New sanctions targeted more than 50 individuals, companies, and vessels connected to Mohammed Hossein Shamkhani's shipping and oil export network. U.S. officials say those networks helped move sanctioned petroleum products, facilitate sanctions evasion, and support Iran's broader regional activities. The goal is to raise the price for Tehran of continuing its campaign against commercial shipping. But Iran is also showing signs that it wants to preserve some diplomatic flexibility. Mohammad Bagher Ghalibaf, Iran's parliamentary speaker and lead negotiator, delivered a carefully balanced message. He argued that Iran would continue resisting militarily, but also needed to use diplomacy to protect national interests. That statement matters because it reflects a familiar Iranian balancing act. Tehran wants to show strength to domestic audiences and regional partners while keeping open the possibility of negotiations if the costs of escalation become too high. One small but notable diplomatic signal came with the release of Dana Karari, a dual U.S.-Iranian citizen who had been prevented from leaving Iran since December 2024. Her release came during active fighting and was described by President Trump as a gesture of goodwill. It remains unclear whether it was connected to broader negotiations, but in a crisis this tense, even limited humanitarian gestures can become important signals. The regional implications are also becoming clearer, especially in Iraq. Washington is using the current crisis to push Baghdad toward reducing the influence of Iranian-backed militias. During meetings with Iraqi Prime Minister Ali al-Zaidi, Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth pressed Iraq to address armed groups that have targeted U.S. personnel. The United States and Iraq are also working on a broader security framework ahead of the planned coalition withdrawal from Iraqi Kurdistan. Energy is another major piece of that relationship. Iraq is exploring ways to reduce its dependence on Hormuz by developing alternative export routes, including pipeline connections that would move Iraqi oil toward the Mediterranean. This is part of a larger regional competition. Iran has spent years using geography as leverage. The U.S. strategy is increasingly focused on removing that advantage by building alternative networks that make Tehran less able to hold regional commerce at risk. Lebanon is another major piece of the puzzle. U.S.-backed talks between Israel and Lebanon have produced preliminary agreement on a framework for Lebanese forces to deploy into parts of southern Lebanon as Israeli forces withdraw from certain positions. The goal is to strengthen Lebanese state control and prevent Hezbollah from rebuilding military infrastructure in those areas. The challenge is Hezbollah itself. The group remains deeply embedded in Lebanese politics and society, while maintaining an independent military capability. Any effort to disarm Hezbollah will require the Lebanese government to take on one of the most difficult security challenges in the Middle East: confronting a powerful armed organization without triggering a broader internal crisis. The political dimension of the conflict is also creating friction between Washington and Jerusalem. Vice President J.D. Vance publicly criticized elements of the Israeli government, accusing some officials of trying to influence American public opinion against ending the war with Iran. Those comments are significant because disagreements between the United States and Israel over Iran policy have typically been handled privately. The death of Senator Lindsey Graham also changes the political landscape. Graham was one of Israel's strongest supporters in Congress and a major advocate for confronting Iran. His absence creates uncertainty at a time when U.S. policy toward the Middle East is already facing internal debate. On the military side, the U.S. has continued expanding strikes against Iranian capabilities linked to the Hormuz fight. Targets have included air defenses, missile systems, coastal surveillance, and facilities connected to Iran's ability to threaten shipping. Iran has responded with missile and drone attacks against U.S. partners, including Jordan, Kuwait, Bahrain, and areas near the U.S. presence in Erbil. One incident highlighted the maritime dimension of the conflict. U.S. forces disabled the tanker MT Belma after saying it ignored warnings while attempting to travel toward an Iranian port. The vessel was struck with Hellfire missiles aimed at its smokestack, preventing it from continuing its route. But the larger story is not the individual strike. It is the competition over credibility. Iran wants regional actors and global markets to believe that Tehran can impose costs even against a far stronger military opponent. The United States wants allies, shipping companies, and adversaries to believe that Iran cannot rewrite the rules of international commerce through coercion. The next phase of this conflict will likely be determined less by who can launch the next strike and more by who can convince the other side that continuing the fight is more expensive than making a deal. That's all for today. Be good to one another, keep your critical thinking switched on, and remember, powerful people can survive a little scrutiny. Find the Daily Brief at restrictedhandling.substack.com.